Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about thrust reversers. What are they used for? How do we use them? And what would happen if a thrust reverser was deployed in flight? Stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, right on.
Third land, 31 right.
Delta 260. See you later, dude.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with Brilliant.org. Now, Brilliant.org will help you to sharpen up on your math skills and understand the essentials of physics in a fun and educative way. So the ones of you who are really quick and uses this link here below, the 500 first of you will get 20% off the annual fee of Brilliant. But as always, it's completely free to check it out, and I guarantee you that if you do, you'll find it really interesting. Right guys, so thrust reversers. This is a fascinating subject, and it's stuff in here that I guarantee you that you didn't know about them. I get a lot of questions regarding thrust reversers when I'm out flying, and generally passengers tend to ask, what is all that noise that happened just after landing? And why does it look like the engines are splitting in two just after landing? Now, in order to understand thrust reversers, we have to start with why we have thrust reversers in the first case. Easy, you say. It's because we need to reduce the landing distance. But that's only partially true, all right? Essentially, the thrust reversers will only reduce the landing distance on a slippery or a wet runway. If it's on a dry runway, the thrust reversers doesn't reduce the landing distance at all. So, why do we see aircraft doing that then? This is a question I actually got on my Facebook channel just a few days ago. Well, why are some airlines using a lot of thrust reversers even on a hot and dry day, and why some doesn't? Well, here is where we get into some of the interesting bits with thrust reversers. Now, if you think about it, an aircraft that's coming in to land, a 737 for example, might be at about 62, 63 tons on landing. It's coming in at a landing speed of about 300 kilometers per hour, so about 150 knots or so. That is an enormous amount of energy that needs to be reduced down to zero before we can taxi off. Without the thrust reversers, the only thing that will take up all of that energy are the brakes. Now, the brakes are only efficient when they are cool. The hotter the brakes becomes, the less efficient the braking will become. This is why when you look at sports cars, for example, the hypercars, they always have little air ducts that lead air in to cool down the brake discs. It's the same on an aircraft. But we don't want that, and especially if you are working in an airline that does very quick turnarounds. We need to be able to reduce that temperature on the brakes as much as possible so that the aircraft can be turned around, the brakes can be cool enough to take off again on the next flight. So thrust reversers will be used in that case as well, but not to reduce the landing distance, but to reduce the brake temperature, right? So this is what we're doing on a nice hot summer day when you hear a lot of reverse thrust being used, is to reduce the temperature of the brakes in order to enable a quick turnaround. If we have a long turnaround, well, then there's enough time for the brakes to cool down by themselves. In that case, thrust reversers will only be selected to idle, but never less than idle. And I'll explain that in a second. So, how do we use them then? Well, if we start in the case of a takeoff, you might know by now that an aircraft needs to have a decision speed. It needs to be calculated before we go, a V1 speed, which is the highest speed at which we can still reject the takeoff and get to a stop within the available runway distance, or the lowest speed to which we can start a takeoff with an engine failure and continue to fly. All right, so we do that calculation on the ground before we taxi out. Now, if we decide to reject the takeoff, that might be because of an engine failure, or because of an engine fire, or because the aircraft is unsafe or unable to fly, or a predicted wind shear warning. Well, in that case, we have to get the aircraft stopped, right? The thrust reversers are actually not part of the calculation on a rejected takeoff. But, like I mentioned before, they're still there to help to reduce the brake energy. So the way that a rejected takeoff is performed, if you want to see exactly how that is done, I recommend you to go into the Mentour Aviation app, and you can see, just get the rejected takeoff and emergency evacuation collection in there. And you'll be able to see in 360 exactly what the captain does and what the first officer does, how we do it and how an evacuation is performed. You'll be able to see it in 360, so you can use your phone or your tablet, and you can use your finger and swipe around, or you can move the phone around to see the entire cockpit, or if you have a Google Cardboard VR headset, it will be just like you're sitting on the jump seat together with me doing the maneuver. Anyway, that's the rejected takeoff, and as you will notice there, the reversers are only selected as the last point. So that's because they're not included in the calculation. Now on the landing, it's different. On the landing, we always select reverse thrust. Always, okay? The way that the landing is performed with reverse thrust in mind is that when you get into the flare, ideally, the thrust levers should be closed back to idle when we touch down. So in a perfect landing, the thrust is completely closed just as the main gear touches down. Now, on main gear touchdown, provided that we have the thrust reversers closed, we will select the reversers to idle. Now, the reversers are those little levers on the front of the main thrust levers. So close the thrust levers, select the thrust reversers. It will take a few seconds for the thrust reversers to activate. And on the 737, what you will see is how a panel on the engine is sliding back and showing some cascade vanes. When the mechanism is fully ready, then you will see two indications above the N1 indication on the engine display turn from amber to green. When that's happening, then we select whatever thrust reverse we need. So if we don't need reverse thrust, we will leave it in idle to have it there if we need it. But in most cases, if we're doing a quick turnaround, for example, we select second detent reverse thrust. So that's from idle up to the first click. And that will give us about 73% N1 reverse thrust. Now, if we need full reverse thrust, so let's say that the runway is slippery, for example, well then there's another detent. So we click once more and that will give us 82. And that's the 82% N1 is the maximum reverse thrust available on the 737. On landing, then it does make a difference, okay? So on a dry runway, no difference. On a wet runway or a slippery runway, the thrust reversers might actually be the only thing that gets the aircraft to stop, because the brakes have an anti-skid system. Basically, the way that the brakes works is that if it feels that the wheels are skidding, which it will do very quickly on a slippery runway, well then brake pressure is removed from the brakes. So if you're landing on a braking action which is medium to poor, for example, as soon as we apply brakes, the anti-skid is going to release it. Okay, and we won't get any braking from the wheels. And in that case, the thrust reversers are essential, and we need to have them full reverse thrust, because that is essentially the only thing that gets the aircraft to stop. Very, very important. Okay, and this goes on taxiways as well. We are able to use the thrust reversers whenever we need it in order to get the aircraft safely stopped. So when do we cancel it then? Well, on landing, because of this, what we do is, on a dry runway or with braking action good, we reduce the thrust from whatever thrust reverse that we've used down to idle at around 60 knots. But we don't cancel it. Okay, it still sits at idle until the captain is absolutely sure that we're back to taxi speed and we can fully stop the aircraft if needed to. Only then are the thrust reversers cancelled, so put flush down again. The reason for this is that you might find that, for example, if we're landing on a slippery runway, they might have cleared the runway very nicely in the middle, on the first or the second third of the runway. But at the last one, that's when the machines that are clearing the runway tend to slow down and maybe make their turns to return. So it might become really, really slippery towards the end of the runway. And of course, if we have then cancelled the thrust and we need it again, well then the whole thrust reversal mechanism needs to be unlocked, opened, and that might take up to 15 seconds to achieve full reverse thrust again. And that is more than what we have. So that's why we sit with idle. So if it turns out that, oh, whoop, it's more slippery than I thought, we can immediately select reverse thrust again. Okay? Now, there are different reverser types. So I will just briefly mention turboprop aircraft. Those are it tends to be smaller aircraft that has propellers instead of fans. Now, those propellers have variable pitch on the propellers. So it's kind of like the gears on your bicycle. You know, if you vary the pitch, so if the propeller is taking bigger slices of air, it'll be heavier for the engine, but it will also produce more thrust. Okay? If you take smaller slices of air, you'll be able to go, climb, for example, more efficiently, but it will not produce the same amount of thrust. There's a lot of theory behind this, but essentially, because you can vary the pitch of the propellers, it means that you can put them into beta, which is instead of producing backward thrust, you can now produce forward thrust, which is an extremely efficient way to create reverse thrust, right? This is fundamentally different from how jet engines produce reverse thrust. So you'll see on, for example, the MD McDonnell Douglas 80 or 82 and some of the Gulfstream aircraft as well, you have what we call bucket type reversers. These are reversers that extend from the back. Essentially, they're hydraulically operated buckets that move hinged back, and they block the entire thrust from the engine and redirect the thrust forward at an angle of about 135 degrees. These are very, very efficient reversers. And they tend to be used on engines with slightly less bypass ratio, slightly smaller engines, for example. On engines like on the 737 and the Airbus 320 and bigger aircraft type as well, well then we use the bypass air to reverse the engines. So in that case, instead of blocking the entire backward motion of the air, then we essentially put down doors in the bypass duct, and as I mentioned before in my videos, the bypass air actually represents about 70% or up to 70% of the thrust of the engine. So if we block the bypass air and we open cascade vanes, we'll be able to redirect all of that air that comes from the fan forward at also about 135 degrees. And that is also a very efficient way of achieving reverse thrust. So those are essentially the three different types of reverse thrust that you will see. And this is why you'll see the engine kind of opening up after landing. And also, this is why you hear the engine rev up, because once the mechanism is in place, well then we need more thrust to direct it forward in order to be efficient. But what about thrust reverse in flight then? Can you actually select reversers in flight? The answer to that question is yes and no. So there are aircraft types that have the capability to select reverse thrust in flight. They tend to be turboprop aircraft. Quite a few of the military transport turboprop aircraft, like the Hercules, for example, and even jet turboprop aircraft, can select reversers to a certain extent in flight, and that is made in order to be able to do tactical high rate of descents in, for example, enemy territory where you will need to get down quickly and land. It is not very comfortable. It creates a lot of buffeting, a lot of vibrations in the aircraft, but it is very efficient. There are also some older type aircraft like the DC-8 that was able to reverse in flight to achieve descent rates of 10,000 feet per minute if needed to. And even the Concorde is rumored to have the capability to reverse 2 of its engines in flight in order to also achieve around 10,000 feet per minute descent rates. But modern transport aircraft like the Boeing 737 and the Airbus 320, for example, they are not able to do so. In fact, it is completely prohibited to use reverse thrust in flight. It is mechanically locked and hydraulically locked in flight, and those locks tends to be connected to either the weight on wheel switches, the switches that are connected to the landing gear that feels the landing gear being compressed, and only then are you able to select reverse thrust. Or in the Boeing 737, it actually is also activated by the fact that the thrust levels are closed and you're below 10 feet radio altimeter. Then the thrust reversers are able to be unlocked. But we're not allowed to do it in flight. But hey, some of you will say, I've seen a YouTube video of a 737 who selected the reversers in flight. And yes, so since the 737 can select the thrust reversers at 10 feet, it can be done. And the video that went viral I think about a year back, of an aircraft coming in a very, it was basically in a severe storm in the UK, did select the reversers just prior to touchdown. It's not approved to do that, but you have to put yourself in the kind of mind of the pilots. The pilots are coming in, it's severe crosswind, high gusty winds, and they're very, very concentrated on getting the aircraft exactly touched down, quickly get reversers up to get the aircraft down to speed where it is fully controllable. Okay, so it is very possible that in that circumstance the pilot jumped the gun a little bit, selected it a little bit prior to touchdown, and if you do that, it will produce a fairly firm touchdown. All right, so it's not something that is recommended or allowed to do. But if you, for whatever reason, would have a mechanical failure, or you wouldn't require several mechanical failures in order for the thrust reversers to inadvertently be selected in flight, well, then you have a problem. The way that the aircraft was tested out was that they are supposed to be controllable at low altitude with one thrust reverser selected at idle thrust. It will create a lot of yaw, it will create a lot of asymmetric thrust, obviously, and an extreme amount of buffeting. But you are supposed to be able to control it at low level, because that's when you have more authority of the rudder in the back. We have a non-normal checklist, a QRH checklist that we can use in that case. And essentially, it will guide us into shutting the engine down that has the thrust reverser activated. If that would happen at high altitude, at like our cruising level, where we are very close to both high speed and low speed buffeting, you would have seen that in my episode about what happens if an aircraft climbs too high, then it is highly likely that the pilots would lose control of the aircraft very quickly. And there has been instances where this has led to real accidents. There was a famous incident that happened back in 1991 where a EVA Air Boeing 767 got the thrust reverser deployed in flight, and the pilots lost control of the aircraft, and it basically spiraled out of control, broke up, and killed everyone on board. And there's been other accidents as well. So after each of these incidents and accidents, the safeguards have been made better and better by the aircraft manufacturers, and now there should be very, very small risk of this ever happening in real life. Right guys, that's what I had about thrust reversers. I'm guessing that you have more questions about this. As always, send them in below, or if you want a straight answer from me directly, well then go into the Mentour Aviation app chat and just tag @Mentour. That will send that question or that message directly to me, and if I'm available, if I'm not out flying, I'll be able to answer it. Or you can ask any of the other commercial pilots that are inside of the app who's there to help you answer all of your questions. I want to send a special thank you to the long-term sponsors of the channel, which is brilliant.org. Now, a course that I think that you guys will enjoy is Science Essentials, where you will learn everything about different measurement units and how to properly apply the scientific process in order to solve a problem. Something that Brilliant have just started with as well that I think that you'll really enjoy are these daily problems that they will send out. Essentially, instead of sitting on the subway just kind of idly checking Facebook, you could be rubbing your brain cells and trying to solve a problem. And if you can't solve that problem, as always when it comes to Brilliant, they will give you the tools needed in order to do so. They will tell you, this is how you should think, this is how you should divide the problem out, and after that you'll be able to solve it, which is a really, really satisfying feeling. Now, the ones of you who are quick and uses this link here below, the 500 first of you will get 20% off the annual subscription fee are brilliant, but it's completely free to check it out, and I highly recommend it because I think if you do, you'll find it as interesting as I found it. Now, wherever you are out there, I want you to take care of yourselves, and if you like this kind of content, if you like me talking about aviation, how pilots do things and how we think about things, well then make sure that you've subscribed to the channel and that you've highlighted the notification bell. If you haven't highlighted the bell, it means that you might not see when I start live streams where I answer your questions, or when I send out these spontaneous vlogs or something like that. So subscribe, highlight the bell, give a like to the video if you like it, take care of yourself, and wherever you are out there, have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye bye.